Hey everyone, thank you very much for tuning in today. Thank you to Dwayne and his team for putting on just a really great event. I know I'm personally really looking forward to engaging with the folks here, listening to a lot of these other presentations and just generally learning what everyone's up to in the industry. So my name is Vivek Nadig. I'm the VP of Strategy for Black Mountain Carbon Lock. So Black Mountain is just a private natural resources operating company. We've had a lot of success building businesses in a number of really high growth natural resource verticals over the last 15 years or so. And in the last probably couple of years, we've just gotten really excited about the carbon markets. We really think that the private sector is going to be key to the growth of these markets and in general for decarbonization solutions to scale. And so we're working really hard on developing projects and opportunities that will continue to build on a lot of our past successes, but also really help develop and scale these carbon markets in general. And so my background, I'm a chemical engineer. I worked in facilities and production in the oil and gas industry for several years before getting an MBA and joining Black Mountain. And here my role is really just being on the front end of developing a lot of the opportunities that we're working on, engaging with a wide range of stakeholders within the carbon markets in particular, and just really helping drive our projects forward internally as well. So today I just wanted to walk through how we think about the voluntary carbon markets in general, where they've been, as well as where we think they're heading, and also just how folks can generally get involved in these markets. And so here's kind of an outline of what we'll be covering today, which you can review at your leisure. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. So Black Mountain, as I mentioned, just a family of private natural resources operating companies founded in 2007 by Rhett Bennett. We've had a lot of success over the years in oil and gas, frac sand mining, saltwater disposal, battery metals. It's just a really entrepreneurial shop, great team, developed a really strong track record over the years. And so really in 2020, we just started seeing this huge wave of decarbonization starting to take off. And all the key stakeholders from governments, companies, and most importantly to us, institutional investors were just getting behind this need for the world to get to net zero. And so as we were seeing all this, we started thinking to ourselves, how are all these folks that are planning to get to net zero actually going to do it? And, I think a lot of folks have come to realize that there have been very minimal details, minimal at least amount of details that have been released by a lot of these organizations around a true plan of how they'll get to net zero and to meet their pledges. And so that's why we started Black Mountain Carbon Lock. So really just to develop commercial opportunities that will help these stakeholders meet their net zero goals by primarily leaning on our just overall large scale project execution expertise and just the ability to navigate these kind of new growing verticals within the energy and natural resource space. And so I want to talk about each of these key stakeholders that I just mentioned. And so I'll start with the government angle. And so from this perspective, obviously they're increasingly recognizing and adopting net zero as a concept. So today we see actually around 90% of global emissions are represented by nations with net zero targets. A lot of this momentum started back in 2015 with the Paris Agreement, where a lot of countries came together, agreed that they would try to limit global temperature increases to 2 degrees Celsius. But what we saw was that really in 2020 and 2021 as well were the times that countries really started, taking a very strong stance towards this. So Japan, South Korea, the US, China, all kind of made their commitments late 20, early 21. Then last year around COP26, we saw Saudi Arabia, Australia, India. And, there's a lot of different views on the robustness of these goals or whether they're just kind of political stances. But in general, we see them as a positive because these commitments then drive policy, which creates incentives for capital to be deployed and projects to be developed. And so on that point, from a capital allocation standpoint, what we now see is that well over a third of the world's assets under management support this goal of net zero by 2050 or sooner. I think that number has actually gone up quite a bit since we last made these slides as well. But what we're seeing is that institutional investors and capital markets are just becoming increasingly focused on this topic. We see several investor-led coalitions to ensure companies are taking necessary emission reduction actions. There's a lot of climate-related shareholder proposals that have gained more and more momentum. And just in general, it's a major topic of discussion, even in the oil and gas industry and across the general commodities complex. And this obviously drives companies to also make pledges to hit net zero. And so today what we see is over 5,000 companies have net zero pledges. When we last updated these slides, over a quarter of the largest public companies in the world also had similar targets. And these are companies across a variety of sectors with very different emission portfolios. And so there's no one kind of size fits all for how you deal with it. And so here I just wanted to quickly touch on this concept of, different scopes of emissions for folks that maybe aren't as familiar. And so scope 1 emissions are those that are directly from the company's operations. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions that are usually generated through electricity or energy production that is purchased by the company. And then scope 3 is just all the other indirect emissions that affect the overall value chain of the company, which can be a very large number depending on the type of industry that the company works in. And so every company has a different mix of these scopes of emissions and therefore needs to deploy a different set of solutions for their emission portfolio. And in particular, what we see is that for these scope 3 emissions, many companies don't have great solutions to date and are relying on some very large offset volumes to actually be able to meet their commitments. So we have a few quotes here on the bottom right from a few different energy companies. And so Eni is one expecting to need around 30 million tons per year of offsets by 2050. Shell has similarly large commitments in the 100 million tons by 2030 range. And Chevron has also large commitments in around 25 million tons of CO2 storage by the end of 2030, all of which are pretty large commitments. And what we'll see soon is that the market may not really have that supply, at least currently. And so what we see is that most of the scientific community now is wanting to limit warming to a 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is even steeper than the 2 degrees Celsius reduction. And to do that, you really need a lot of different emission reduction solutions. So we see the need for both your conventional mitigation technologies that reduce and avoid emissions as much as possible, but also these carbon removal solutions that actually pull out, atmospheric CO2 and remove those really unavoidable emissions like those from aviation, shipping, cement, steel, and things like that. And so on that point, I just want to make a distinction between the various forms of carbon abatement and how they're viewed by the market. So on the left-hand side here, we have carbon reduction and avoidance. And so what that means is just reducing emissions from current sources through improved alternatives. So that could be replacing a coal-fired power plant with renewable electricity, could be protecting a forest and avoiding the loss of a natural carbon sink. And there's several others, but the goal is to just avoid the release of more emissions from existing sources. Alternatively, there's also carbon removal, which is actually pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it in the biosphere, in nature, or in the geosphere, subsurface reservoirs. And so these projects really neutralize the hardest to abate emissions, but a lot of times they just require more capital, longer paybacks, given current policy and sort of market conditions. But the takeaway here is that all of these different forms of decarbonization are going to be critical for the world and these markets to reach net zero. And so when we take a look at all of this, what we see and what we find very exciting is, I think what a lot of folks in the industry also find exciting is there's just this huge need for carbon sequestration as a whole. And given just the skill set required for a sequestration project, it overlaps very nicely with a lot of the skill sets that have been developed by folks in the oil and gas industry over the last several decades. And what we see is that basically any net zero scenario you look at calls for massive increase in deployment of CCUS. Otherwise, the world faces a significantly more expensive energy transition. CCUS projects, not going to talk too much about these as we're mainly focused on kind of the voluntary markets today, but it's something that we're very excited about and glad to see a lot of presentations here are also focused on them. So now I want to actually talk about the carbon markets as a whole. And so the headline here is that the price of carbon is going way up. These markets are growing pretty significantly. And in our view, there's just a lot of money to be made in space. And so you can break up the carbon markets into two main categories. So first, you have regulatory or compliance-based markets, and these are typically government-run emissions reduction programs that are set up for specific industries that fall within a specific geography and force those companies to offset their emissions through purchasing some sort of allowance or credit that's certified by the government. These markets are still very fragmented. Different policies exist, even in similar geographies that are geared to different sectors. There's different rules for each jurisdiction. It's just tough to navigate and doesn't necessarily apply to everyone. The other main part of the market, obviously, is the voluntary market. And so these markets help companies that maybe don't fall into a compliance mechanism meet their net zero commitments to shareholders, customers, employees, et cetera. And they can do so by purchasing carbon credits or carbon offsets. Now, there are entities called registries, which we'll talk about in more detail shortly, that track these offset projects and then issue credits for each unit of reduction that's verified. And then there are these methodologies, which we'll also talk about in more detail, that lay out the rules for which projects can generate these credits and how the accounting overall has to work. And so those are kind of the key points to keep in mind as we talk through these voluntary markets. But as we mentioned earlier, both compliance and the voluntary markets are really blowing up right now. Looking at a couple of the more famous compliance markets, so the EU's ETS and California's cap and trade, both of them saw just really crazy price appreciation last year. Some others, like the Australian carbon markets, as well as a few more, even doubled or grew more than that last year. So just a lot of surging prices in these spaces over the last year or so. Jumping into the voluntary markets, what we see on the right-hand side here is that, the market really just blew up in 2020 and 2021. The traded volumes really just drastically increased in a way that we hadn't seen before. The value of traded offsets grew from 473 million to about 750 million just through 8 months in 2021. So there's a ton of interest coming into the space. But when you look at the projects, there just aren't enough of them really right now. There's also a shortage of removal projects and what we consider, high integrity carbon projects, which can often can often demand quite a bit higher pricing. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a couple slides. And so generally right now, the price of carbon in the voluntary markets on average is not very high because there are several different methodologies and types of projects you can develop. And we're really seeing the need for the quality of the project to continue to increase or continue to get better. And that's important to keep in mind because the quality of these credits is really what drives the willingness to pay. So when you think about the end customer or large corporate that's buying these, they want to ensure that their dollars are going towards a project that is truly making an impact from an emissions reduction standpoint. And that's what drives how much they're willing to pay for these projects. And so on the left-hand side here, we just show the kind of drastic differences we've seen in the prices paid for technological removals, such as direct air capture, bioenergy, and CCS, versus your typical kind of nature-based removal projects, which are also great. Those are afforestation, reforestation, et cetera. But among all these projects, whether they're technological or nature-based, the key drivers of value that folks need to keep in mind are what we show here on the right-hand side. And so I'll walk through each of these, but to start, the key one is additionality. And you'll hear that word thrown out, and all it means is that the reductions or removals that the project is making would not have taken place without the kind of sales of the carbon credits, meaning that these reductions or removals wouldn't have been financed without the sale of carbon credits. Then there's obviously the permanence aspect. And so this one's pretty straightforward. If the carbon is stored, it needs to be stored for as long as possible to truly make a difference from a global temperature rise standpoint. And so subsurface storage is obviously going to be the longest or the greatest amount of permanence, but there's a lot of nature-based ways to also significantly increase that level of permanence. There has to be a low risk of leakage. And what that means is obviously one, the ability for CO2 to return to the atmosphere through a wildfire or disease or a breach of a reservoir. But it could also mean the displacement of emissions. And what that could mean is that just because a carbon project pops up in one area and a forest maybe is protected, that doesn't help the forest next door, which ends up being kind of cut down. And the emissions just moved rather than actually being reduced. And then the last piece is just co-benefits. And this one has been something that we've been looking into pretty closely recently. Just community and environmental benefits from a project can actually really drive up the price that folks are willing to pay when they can truly see that in addition to the carbon reduction that they're making, there's clear benefits to the community, whether that's increased biodiversity, more efficient water use, economic development of a community. And that can be really great for a lot of these projects. And so all that being said, what we have found is that high quality carbon offset projects and in general carbon removals in particular are in very high demand right now. So we talk to developers all the time, every week, that say they're fully sold out of offsets, trying to find new projects to develop, and this is only going to increase for them. And so the list that we show here has some groups that have really focused on afforestation, reforestation, and technological removals like direct air capture. But when you think about some of the offset purchase commitments that have been made, like we discussed earlier with some of the energy companies, it's pretty staggering. And what we kind of see is that there's just a huge amount of demand that is coming in the near future. Energy companies, mining companies, the airline industry has kind of a huge requirement there. And overall, it's just a very interesting time to be in the market. And so now I wanted to shift specifically to these voluntary carbon offsets, talk through how they work, what the oversight mechanisms look like, and how they're being purchased. And so to start with the general life cycle of a carbon offset, this is usually how it works. So the offset gets generated by a project developer, then it's transferred to the consumer of the credit, and then retired, meaning it's crossed off the registry and should never be counted again against any emissions reduction goals. And so the way this works is, first you need a methodology, and before any greenhouse gas reductions can be certified for use as carbon offsets, they have to show that they meet this offset quality criteria, which is laid out in the methodology. And so within that protocol or methodology, you also have kind of the accounting requirements and the math that needs to be done that will prove how many reductions are being made. So once you have that, you can start developing the project, get it validated by an independent party and registered on one of the main registries. Then you implement the project and actually have to verify it. So to take a simple example of afforestation, you need to first pick your methodology for the exact kind of afforestation strategy you're taking. You go out, plant the trees, get the project registered, et cetera. And then you actually have to go back out and verify the emission reductions have taken place. So that could be counting up how many trees are out there, what their growth rates have looked like, things of that nature, to be able to quantify how much CO2 has actually been stored. And only then will you actually be issued the credits and have the ability to transfer them to a consumer. In the case of a technological removals like DAC or CCS, it's a bit more straightforward. You meter this stored CO2 as you're injecting it, and then track the plume. And then based on the verification of these projects, you get a set number of offsets, transfer them, they get retired by the consumer, who can then cross them off their emissions reductions that they've stated they would make. And so in this whole process, the carbon credit registry, which we mentioned earlier, is a pretty key stakeholder, as they provide a lot of the quality assurance. And in doing so, they have to have standards and protocols that these offset projects have to meet. The reason for this is just to provide consumers with more transparency and confidence into the integrity and quality of the credits that they're buying. And so there's 4 main registries that most folks list their projects on. We have them here. So the American Carbon Registry, Climate Action Reserve, the Gold Standard, and Verra. Each one of these has their own sets of methodologies used by different developers, different use cases, make sense for different geographies, et cetera. What we've seen is that Verra has become the most popular one in recent years. It's very internationally accepted, has a lot of wide-ranging methodologies, well trusted by the vast majority of stakeholders. And so I'll go in just very briefly into Verra. I would maybe say to review this a bit more on your own time if you'd like to better understand kind of how the main Verra standard works, which is the verified carbon standard. But what we see is that this is very much the most highly used registry for credit issuances. And what we saw is that their verified carbon units have continued to increase in traded volumes year over year. And what we saw in 2021 was that both a monthly and quarterly record were set for the number of issued VCUs. And so in addition to that, we know there are a number of new methodologies currently under development that'll keep unlocking the market, allow for more project development. And then just want to touch on one more main aspect of these registries, which is the validation and verification processes. So basically, anytime the project is set up, it has to be validated in order to prove that it's a legit project and all the carbon accounting works out. Then as the project progresses, it'll need to be continuously verified, again, to ensure the reductions claimed are actually taking place. And there's several approved verification companies that you just go out and hire to make sure that you're meeting all your requirements. And very experienced, solid experts in these companies that can walk you through exactly what you need to know as you're developing different projects, or if you're purchasing credits from a project, you can be sure that a lot of these groups have done their homework in making sure that it's set up properly. And then just to kind of round us out, I want to talk about the actual selling and purchasing of these credits. So a lot of times, of course, it can happen, B2B between the developer and the group that needs the credits. There's also a lot of market intermediaries, as you would expect, brokers, marketers, different groups that can sell credits for you as you develop them, or can connect you to project developers if you're looking to purchase credits. And then there's even more recently exchanges that have been developed. So CBL Expansive is probably the biggest one that allows for carbon products to be transacted in a more transparent exchange. And so what we've seen on Expansive is that they have a number of these emissions offset contracts that meet various registry requirements and can really be used by a number of different industries to offset their emissions. So CBL's main products are the GEO, so the global emissions offset, and nature-based GEO product, which are Vera offsets and are set up for airlines to also use to cut their emissions. And what we've seen here, as we did in all these other cases, is that in 2021, some dramatic price increases, especially in Q4. And part of that just goes back to our slide on the value drivers of offsets. A lot of these products that Expansive is hosting do have co-benefits included, various labels that prove that they are helping with the community and have additional benefits besides just their emissions reduction. But the main driver, of course, is just that there's significantly increasing demand for these credits. More companies are starting to get closer to the commitments that they've made, and really just we only see these prices going up, even if there are short-term decreases. It's just a place that a lot of folks are really excited about. Black Mountain is extremely excited about where the carbon markets are going. Looking at a number of different ways to play them, and really looking forward to continuing to track how things move. So with that, I'll close and look forward to catching up with folks in the Q&A, and always feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about what we've talked about today. So thanks everyone for taking the time to listen in, and appreciate it.